The Great Custody Battle. About Abraham. If you were to somehow invent a time machine, travel back roughly 4,000 years, land in the dusty, sun-baked plains of the ancient Near East, walk up to a very wealthy, highly stressed nomadic sheep herder sitting in the shade of a goat hair tent and ask him, "Excuse me, sir, are you a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim?" He would look at you with the absolute, uncomprehending blankness of a man who has just been asked if his favorite flavor of ice cream is Wi-Fi. He would have absolutely no idea what you were talking about. And yet, for the last couple of millennia, the three largest, most powerful, and most heavily armed religious franchises on the planet have been engaged in the ultimate, high-stakes theological custody battle over this exact man. Today, we are going to talk about Abraham. We are going to examine the absolutely hilarious, historically impossible, and deeply absurd human obsession with trying to slap a modern religious name tag on a Bronze Age wanderer. We are going to look at the timeline, the geopolitics, the ancient cultural weirdness, and the sheer chronological comedy of drafting a 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian dude into your modern denomination. I'm Holy Timelines, and this is the Unheard Stories of the Bible. Today, the Great Custody Battle. To understand the absolute comedy of this situation, you have to understand how desperate humanity is for a good origin story. Everyone wants the founders' rights. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam collectively represent more than half of the human population on Earth. That is over 4 billion people. And all three of these massive, sprawling global empires point their incredibly wealthy, highly bureaucratic fingers all the way back to the exact same guy. They all claim him. They all want the rights to his biography. They all want to print him on their spiritual letterhead and say, he was the first one of us. But to figure out who Abraham actually was, we have to do something that modern theologians really, really hate doing. We have to look at a calendar. And we have to look at the actual historical dirt of the Bronze Age. Let us start with the first and most common assumption. Abraham was the first Jew. If you stop a random person on the street and ask them what religion Abraham was, 99% of them will confidently tell you he was Jewish. It makes total sense, right? He is the patriarch of the Jewish people. He is the guy who started the whole thing. But historically and linguistically speaking, calling Abraham a Jew is like calling George Washington a millennial. The math is completely, hopelessly broken. Let's break down the word Jew. The word Jew comes from the word Judah. Judah was the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Specifically, Judah was the name of the fourth son of Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac, and Isaac was the son of Abraham. Therefore, Judah is Abraham's great-grandson. To say that Abraham was a Judah-ite, which is what the word Jew literally means, is to claim that a man belonged to a religion named after his own unborn great-grandson. That is a biological and chronological impossibility. It is the ultimate grandfather paradox. You cannot be a card-carrying member of a club named after a kid who hasn't even been thought of yet. Furthermore, let's look at the actual religious practices of Judaism. The bedrock of the Jewish faith is the Torah, the Law of Moses. This includes the Ten Commandments, the incredibly complex dietary laws of Kashrut, the Levitical priesthood, the observation of the Sabbath, and the strict prohibition against eating pork or mixing meat and dairy. When did the Law of Moses happen? It happened with Moses at Mount Sinai, roughly 500 to 600 years after Abraham was dead and buried in a cave in Hebron. This means that Abraham, the so-called first Jew, lived his entire life in a state of absolute, blissful, unkosher ignorance. He had no Torah. He had no synagogue. He had never heard of a rabbi. If you read the book of Genesis carefully, in chapter 18, there is a famous scene where 3 mysterious visitors, who turn out to be the Lord and 2 angels, show up at Abraham's tent. Abraham is a good host. He rushes to prepare a meal. And what does the great patriarch of Judaism serve the creator of the universe? He takes a freshly roasted calf, and he serves it to them, along with curds and milk. He serves God a cheeseburger. He literally mixes meat and dairy in the exact same meal, serving it on the same table, which is a massive, fundamental violation of the kosher laws that would be invented half a millennium later. If a modern Orthodox rabbi time traveled to that lunch, he would have a heart attack right there in the desert. Abraham didn't keep the Passover, because there was nothing to pass over yet. The Israelites hadn't even gone to Egypt to become slaves, let alone escape it. Abraham didn't celebrate Hanukkah, because the Maccabean revolt wouldn't happen for another 1,800 years. Calling Abraham a Jew is like calling a Neanderthal a licensed real estate agent. The institutional framework simply did not exist. All right, so if he wasn't a Jew in the historical sense, let's look at the second contender. The Christians. Christianity claims Abraham as their spiritual father. The Apostle Paul writes an entire, brilliant argument in the book of Romans explaining how Abraham was justified by faith long before the Jewish law was ever given, thereby making him the prototype for the Christian believer. Christians love Abraham. They sing songs about him in Sunday school. Father Abraham had many sons, and I am one of them, and so are you. It involves a lot of aggressive arm swinging and marching in place, but was Abraham a Christian? Again, let us consult the unforgiving, brutal logic of the calendar. The word Christian literally means a follower of Christ. Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, was born roughly 2,000 years after Abraham. 2,000 years. To put that chronological chasm into perspective, 2,000 years ago from today, the Roman Empire was still throwing people to the lions, Julius Caesar had just been stabbed in the Senate, and indoor plumbing was considered cutting-edge, billionaire-level technology. That is the massive historical distance between Abraham and Jesus. Abraham had absolutely no concept of a cross, a church, a pope, a Protestant Reformation, a worship band, or a church potluck. He did not know what a baptism was. He did not own a leather-bound King James Bible. If you tried to explain the concept of the Trinity to Abraham, a man who grew up in a culture that worshipped the moon and thought the sky was a solid dome of water, his head would have literally exploded. Christians claim Abraham because he had faith. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. But having faith in a divine voice telling you to pack your bags and move to the desert does not automatically make you a practicing member of a religion that won't be incorporated for another 2 millennia. Drafting Abraham into Christianity is like trying to give Aristotle a Nobel Prize in computer science. The man was undoubtedly great, but he didn't have the hardware. So we arrive at the third massive global contender, Islam. With over 1.5 billion followers, Islam has a very specific, very bold claim on Abraham, who is known in the Quran as Ibrahim. The Quran explicitly states in Surah Al-Imran, verse 67, Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was one inclining toward truth, a Muslim. Now on the surface, this sounds like an absolute mic drop. The text literally says he was a Muslim. End of debate. But we have to understand the linguistic loophole that is being used here. The word Muslim in Arabic, in its most literal lowercase m translation, simply means one who submits to God. In that purely theological, linguistic sense, Islam argues that anyone in human history who submitted to the one true God was technically a Muslim. By that broad definition, Noah was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim, and Jesus was a Muslim. But if we are talking about Islam as an institutional, historical religion, the uppercase M Islam with the 5 pillars, we run into the exact same brick wall of the calendar. The religion of Islam was founded by the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century CE. That is over 2,600 years after Abraham lived. Abraham did not read the Quran because it wouldn't be revealed for another 26 centuries. He did not pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. In fact, according to the Islamic tradition itself, Abraham and his son Ishmael actually built the Kaaba in Mecca. You can't pray facing a sacred building that you are currently doing the masonry work for. Abraham didn't observe the month of Ramadan. He didn't know what a mosque was. Claiming Abraham as a practicing institutional Muslim in 2000 BC is like claiming that Julius Caesar was a huge fan of the Beatles. It's a wonderful unifying thought, but the timeline strictly hilariously forbids it. So if the calendar completely destroys the idea that Abraham was a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, who on earth was he? What was his actual, historical, religious, and cultural identity? If you want the brutally honest, historically accurate, and entirely unglamorous answer, Abraham was a Mesopotamian tech bro who dropped out of society. He was from a city called Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, when we picture Abraham, we usually picture a guy who has always lived in a tent in the middle of nowhere. But Ur was not nowhere. Ur was a massive, bustling, hyper-advanced Sumerian metropolis located in what is today southern Iraq. It was the New York City of the Bronze Age. It was situated near the mouth of the Euphrates River, making it a global hub for trade. The people of Ur lived in 2-story brick houses with plastered walls. They had complex legal codes. They had advanced irrigation systems. They did math using a base 60 system, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour today. They brewed beer. They had musical instruments. They had a booming, highly bureaucratic economy that tracked grain shipments on cuneiform clay tablets. And more importantly, the city of Ur had a god. The patron deity of Ur was a moon god named Sin. Yes, the god's name was literally Sin, which makes for very confusing English translations when you try to read Sumerian poetry. The center of the city was dominated by the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive, towering step pyramid dedicated to the moon. According to the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 2, Joshua stands in front of the Israelites centuries later and delivers a harsh historical truth. He says, long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. Read that carefully. Abraham's family were pagans. They were polytheists. They worshipped the moon. Abraham did not grow up going to Sunday school. He grew up in an advanced, urban culture that offered sacrifices to celestial bodies to make sure the barley didn't die. And then, one day, something absurd happens. The story of Abraham is not the story of a man who belonged to a religion. It is the story of a man who heard a voice. According to the text, a deity he had presumably never heard of before, Yahweh, spoke to him. And this God did not hand him a holy book. He didn't hand him a catechism. He didn't ask him to sign a statement of faith, recite a creed, or build a cathedral. God simply said, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. That is the entire foundation of his faith. Start walking, and I'll tell you when to stop. Imagine the logistical comedy of this moment. Abraham is 75 years old. He is incredibly wealthy. He has a massive entourage of servants, flocks of sheep, herds of cattle, and a very whiny nephew named Lot. He goes to his wife Sarah, who is sitting in their comfortable, plastered multi-room house in a wealthy Mesopotamian suburb, and he says, pack everything. We are leaving the greatest civilization on earth to live in a goat hair tent in a desert. And when Sarah asks, where are we going? Abraham has to look her in the eye and say, I have absolutely no idea. A voice in my head said he'd point it out when we get there. Abraham's religion consisted entirely of walking, building small piles of unhewn rocks called altars whenever something significant happened, and trying not to get killed by local Canaanite kings. And let's talk about those local kings, because Abraham's moral compass was, frankly, all over the place. We treat him like a glowing saint, but this is a man who is flying completely blind. Twice, not once, but twice, he pulls the exact same scam. He travels to a foreign country because of a famine. He looks at his wife Sarah, who is apparently staggeringly beautiful even in her old age, and he gets nervous. He thinks, the local warlord is going to kill me and steal my wife. So what does the great patriarch of 3 world religions do? He looks at Sarah and says, hey, do me a favor. Tell everyone you're my sister. He literally throws his wife under the bus to save his own skin. He goes to Egypt, tells Pharaoh that Sarah is his sister, and Pharaoh says, great, I'll take her for my harem, and here's a bunch of camels and sheep as a dowry. Abraham actually takes the payout. He's sitting outside the palace, counting his new livestock, while his wife is inside the royal harem. God has to step in, inflict horrible plagues on Pharaoh's household, and basically scream at the Egyptian king, excuse me, that is his wife, give her back. Pharaoh calls Abraham in, completely furious, and says, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Take her and get out of my country. You would think Abraham learned his lesson. But years later, he goes to the region of Gerar, meets a king named Abimelech, and does the exact same thing. She's my sister. Abimelech takes her. God appears to Abimelech in a dream and says, you are a dead man, you took another man's wife. Abimelech wakes up terrified, calls Abraham and says, what is wrong with you? I almost got smitten because of your lie. And Abraham's excuse is legendary. He says, well, technically, she is my half-sister. We have the same father, just a different mother. He uses a technicality. The father of global faith tried to loophole his way out of human trafficking. Abraham was not a sanitized saint holding a glowing halo. He was a flawed, terrified, wandering man, trying to navigate a brutal, unforgiving world without a map. But don't mistake his fear for a lack of toughness. When he needed to be, Abraham was an absolute action hero. In Genesis chapter 14, a coalition of 4 powerful Mesopotamian kings invades the region. They conquer 5 local kings, sack the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they kidnap Abraham's nephew, Lot. When Abraham hears that his nephew has been taken, he doesn't pray for a diplomatic resolution. He goes full John Wick. The text says he calls out the 318 trained men born in his household. Abraham is a septuagenarian warlord with a private militia. He marches this small band of guys hundreds of miles north, attacks the massive coalition of 4 victorious kings at night, completely routs their entire army, chases them all the way to Damascus, gets all the stolen loot back, and rescues his nephew. He basically tells the empires of the Bronze Age, don't touch my family. But the most famous and perhaps the most terrifyingly comedic test of his faith comes in Genesis chapter 17. Abraham is 99 years old. He has been walking in the desert for 24 years. God appears to him and says, I am going to make a covenant with you. I am going to make you the father of many nations. Abraham says, great, what do I need to do? Sign a clay tablet? Sacrifice a bull? And God says, no, I need you to circumcise yourself and every male in your household. Today, let us pause and appreciate the sheer, unadulterated horror of this moment. We are in the Bronze Age. There is no anesthesia. There is no surgical steel. There are no antibiotics. They used sharpened flint knives. Abraham is 99 years old, and he has to go out to his camp of 318 hardened, battle-tested mercenaries and say, "Good news, boys! God spoke to me. Bad news. Drop your trousers." The fact that there wasn't a massive, bloody mutiny right there in the desert is perhaps the greatest miracle in the entire book of Genesis. But Abraham did it. He submitted to an agonizing, bizarre, physical brand of loyalty because the voice told him to. And then there is the family drama. If you pitched the story of Abraham's family to a reality television producer today, they would tell you it's too toxic for cable. His wife Sarah can't have kids. So following the very weird surrogate laws of the ancient Near East, she gives her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abraham. Hagar gets pregnant with Ishmael. Sarah instantly regrets the entire plan and becomes incredibly abusive to Hagar. Hagar runs away into the desert. God sends her back. Years later, Sarah miraculously has a baby, Isaac, at the age of 90. She catches the teenage Ishmael mocking little Isaac. Sarah snaps. She demands that Abraham permanently kick Hagar and Ishmael out into the lethal wilderness to die. And Abraham, the great patriarch of faith, actually does it. He gives them some bread and a skin of water and sends his firstborn son out into the scorching desert. It is brutal. It is deeply uncomfortable. This is the man that billions of people are fighting over. A man who let his wife get kidnapped to save his own life, who banished his firstborn son into the desert to appease his wife's jealousy, and who haggled with God over the destruction of Sodom like he was trying to buy a used camel at a bazaar. What if there are 50 righteous people? 45? 40? 10? But here is the absolute, unvarnished genius of the biblical text. The Bible does not hide any of this. It does not try to sanitize him. It puts all of Abraham's cowardice, all of his cultural baggage, all of his weird Bronze Age logic, and all of his massive mistakes right out in the open for everyone to read. Why? Because the greatness of Abraham was not his moral perfection. It was not his theology. It was not his religious affiliation. His greatness was his willingness to keep walking. He is remembered because when the voice in the dark told him to leave the most advanced, comfortable city in the world and wander in a desert, he packed his tents. When the voice told him to take a flint knife to his own flesh at the age of 99, he did it. And when the voice told him to take the son he had waited a century for, walk up a mountain in Moriah with a bundle of wood, and offer him as a sacrifice, he walked up the mountain. He didn't understand it, it broke his heart, but he kept walking until the angel stopped his hand. Abraham didn't have a religion. He had a relationship. And it was a terrifying, unpredictable, violently disruptive relationship with an invisible God who absolutely refused to fit into any of the neat, tidy, polytheistic boxes of ancient Mesopotamian culture. The comedy of the great custody battle is that Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all fighting to the death over a man who would not have qualified to join any of their modern institutions. If Abraham walked into a modern Orthodox synagogue today, they would be horrified that he ate a cheeseburger, that he didn't keep the Sabbath, and that he didn't know a single word of the Talmud. If Abraham walked into a modern evangelical megachurch, they would be deeply uncomfortable with his multiple wives, his concubines, his violent mercenary tactics, and his complete ignorance of the New Testament. If Abraham walked into a modern mosque in Mecca, they would be shocked that he didn't speak Arabic, that he didn't know the rituals of the Hajj, and that he drank wine. We have spent 2,000 years building massive, intricate, heavily decorated theological boxes. We have built cathedrals, synagogues, and mosques. We have written endless volumes of canon law and systematic theology, and we are obsessed with trying to shove this wild, ancient, nomadic shepherd into our specific box to prove that we are the sole legitimate heirs to his legacy. We want to tame him. We want to put a suit and tie on him and make him the chairman of our board. But Abraham refuses to fit in the box. He stands completely outside of our institutional walls, covered in the dust of the ancient Near East, smelling like sheep and campfire smoke, laughing at our obsession with labels. He is the ultimate, undeniable reminder that the origins of human faith are infinitely messier, infinitely stranger, and infinitely more human than our polished, sanitized modern religions want to admit. He was not a Jew. He was not a Christian. He was not a Muslim. He was a wealthy, polytheistic tech bro from Iraq who heard a voice, looked up at the stars, dropped everything, and decided to take a very, very long walk. And in doing so, he accidentally changed the entire course of human history.